This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights, closed captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today, we welcome Alison Lynch, staff attorney at Disability Rights New York, and we're talking about mental health and sports culture. Alison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this.
So we're talking about the sports community and mental health today. This conversation was spurred by the recent news of Naomi Osaka. She pulled out of the French Open to care for her own mental health. The responses from the media, the public, and other athletes, it was kind of a mixed bag, right? There were some messages of support. In fact, there were a lot of messages from support, but there were also some responses that were not so supportive, and they were not very kind. And really, Naomi has been just the most recent athlete to make the news by disclosing. However, she isn't the first. And as we've talked about, this is a very large subject, and there are a lot of other factors that come into each and every one of the different athletes who have disclosed about their own mental health. And we will definitely be continuing this conversation about mental health disclosure, athletes, and the general public. But today we're going to stick with Naomi, what has happened with her specifically. And certainly in our audience, if there are questions or other parts of this topic they'd like to hear, they can let us know, because certainly this will not be the last conversation we have about it. So Alison, our audience may not know this, but you are also an accomplished athlete as well as an attorney at DRNY. Talk to us about what the sports community has been like for you and what this latest incident with Naomi illustrates about sports culture, especially when talking about mental health.
Sure. So let me first start with the caveat that I'm not a professional athlete and I can't directly speak or relate to Naomi Osaka's experiences, but this particular topic has definitely hit close to home for me because, as you mentioned, outside of DRNY, I compete as a visually impaired athlete in both running and triathlon. I've had the chance to race at the national level, and because I do have a vision disability, I've also had experiences needing accommodations and receiving somewhat of a mixed responses to my requests as well. But the big difference here is that, unfortunately, my requests for accommodations due to a physical disability are in some ways better received or seen as more standard or expected because of some really great pushes for diversity in sport. And I say, unfortunately, because that kind of same embrace of difference isn't always extended to athletes who advocate for their mental health or who speak out about how mental health has impacted their careers. I think there are some great initiatives out there, but kind of just as we see in society at large, people's understanding and acceptance of mental health is still very much a work in progress due to a lot of what we know to be really ingrained bias and stigma. And so requests for accommodations that stem from mental health really shouldn't be treated any differently than those that stem from physical disabilities. But I think that's kind of the gray area that we're living in right now is recognizing that professional athletes may actually need a much wider variety of accommodations, both during a game or a race or a match, but also before or after. The interviews and contracts and sponsorships are all arguably just as much of an integral part of their professional career. So they should also be viewed as kind of fitting squarely within that space where accommodations may need to be made.
And you just brought up an interesting topic within this topic. I think as we talk about professional athletes and we talk about whether it is the sport itself or what each athlete is going through, there is a perception of some type of superhuman ability that they certainly should. The perception is that they should be able to go on through the game. That's part of the toughness of being a really great athlete. And I think the perceptions, whether it's the public or the media has, are that these athletes work really hard. They should just be able to, shrug it off and still run if they sprain their knee or if they're not feeling well. So I do think the public perception part of it is key. And as you were just discussing, with mental health, it is regarded in sports culture very differently. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about not only the perception, but the disparity between caring for mental health and caring for a physical injury. Shortly after Naomi withdrew from the French Open, Petra Kvitova withdrew because of an ankle injury, one that actually happened during a media event. There certainly wasn't the public backlash or pushback after her announcement. And Alison, let's be very clear, this isn't just in the sports community, as we were just talking about. It's vastly different reactions come from every angle when we're talking about physical injury versus mental health care. Let's talk a little bit about that. Talk about why players' injuries are equally concerning and deserve the same care.
Yeah, this is such an important comparison and one that kind of gets lost a little bit. There are a couple of nuances. One is that sometimes, like you mentioned, when you're in a game, or in my case, if you're in a race and you're not feeling 100% because, maybe your knee tweaked or maybe you didn't eat the right thing for breakfast, you are forcing yourself to go on and other people are screaming at you to go on. And that's not what we're talking about. Both that kind of mental and physical struggle, that's part of being an athlete. That's part of pushing your body, pushing your mind. What I think we need to focus on are exactly the kind of injuries that you mentioned and the kind of disabilities that can impact someone's ability to do a job outside of that kind of race day moment where you have to push your hardest and, there may be obstacles. But what we're really talking about here is the fact that really under the law, as an employer, physical health disabilities and mental health disabilities are really not and should not be viewed in vastly different terms by any means. The accommodations may be different because they are unique to the disability, but a mental health diagnosis should be taken just as seriously as a physical health diagnosis. We're so kind of accustomed to athletes being transparent about their physical health issues because their bodies are such a key factor in their careers. It's all kind of public knowledge. We're really only scratching the surface of advocacy in having conversations about how athletes' mental health and well-being are equally important in how an athlete prepares and plays and recovers. There are sports psychologists who have been working with top athletes for decades, but again, because of this bias and this stigma and discomfort in having some of those conversations, we don't hear about that nearly as much as we do about a physical therapist working on an ankle injury or an athlete getting an MRI because of a spinal cord injury. There are just such disparities in the types of conversations that we're comfortable about having, even though there really shouldn't be a difference between the types of injuries or the types of health conditions that we're discussing.
That's so true. And I think even how those, I would say myths, but it's really misconceptions that are promoted even with, I think of any of the Rocky movies where we see, cut, battered and bruised and, the coach is pushing him on to go ahead and get back out there. And that is viewed as how an athlete should move through their career or their game or their match without much thought as to what else is going on with them. And certainly when we talk about the physical part of being an athlete, there are athletes that have certain parts of their body that are actually insured, right? So contractually, those parts of their body are insured. And I don't know that a whole person is insured, including their mental well-being. And that brings us to another interesting part of this conversation, which is contractual agreements, right? So professional athletes have contracts. They need to sign them, whether it's through the people who are branding them or whatever event, like in this case, the French Open, in order to participate. And then there's the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is what we work on here, of course. However, Naomi was fined $15,000 because of her contract for not meeting the requirement. And the officials at the French Open were threatening more severe consequences. She did not meet those contractual obligations, and she ultimately withdrew because of these issues. So in the US, we do have the ADA. And if this tournament were here in the US, would Naomi or other athletes be protected by the ADA? I think that's a question our audience would like to know the answer to. And if she had signed a contract, what can an athlete do when it comes to their mental health needs when they're under a contractual obligation?
So I'm going to kind of go on what you've said here and create a little bit of a hypothetical. We're going to assume that this is all taking place within the United States, that this, imaginary United States tournament we're going to look at that role as an employer, and we're going to look at the role of Naomi Osaka as an employee. And that's a kind of good context to root our understanding of the ADA in. For some very quick background for our audience who might not necessarily be familiar with the ADA is a federal law that is put in place to protect individuals with disabilities from discrimination. So in this case, we'd be talking about it in the context of employment discrimination. And really at its core, in order to bring a claim under the ADA, a person must demonstrate that they have a disability that substantially impacts a major life activity or a day-to-day activity that the average person can easily perform. So if that's proven, then under the ADA, that person must be given a reasonable accommodation in order for that person to perform what the legal terminology says is an essential function of the employment. So if there's no way for that person to perform these essential functions due to their disability, even with reasonable accommodations, then that person's contract or employment could be terminated. But way before we get to that point, the understanding of accommodations and the interactive process to try and negotiate and arrive at terms that work for everybody to put accommodations in place is really how we should be thinking about questions like this. It's interesting to apply here to Naomi Osaka. Her disability is an anxiety disorder, and that is something that would likely qualify her for ADA protections in the US. And so the question really becomes whether the interviews that she was contractually obligated to do are an essential function of her employment. So the argument that she could make, a number of other athletes have made on her behalf, is that she's just there to play tennis, that the actual matches are the truly essential part of her employment and contracts. She's there to play the sport that she excels in, and she has no issue doing that. She doesn't need accommodations in the matches. Anything else that's not playing tennis can still be part of a job, but not considered essential. So there's a little bit more room for her to negotiate terms about how she chooses to do those non-essential parts of her job. But the flip side of that argument, commentators and fans and some other athletes have raised, is that the interaction with the press as well as the matches are all together kind of a combined core essential function of the job. That press interaction generates interest and fan support, which drives money and sponsors. And so without the money and fans and sponsors, there would be no big tournament on this level. And that could ultimately impact professional tennis as a whole. So, this is obviously a worst case scenario, really broad, slippery slope type argument, but these are the kinds of things that would need to be considered at the outset if she were to come in and say, I want to have a conversation about reasonable accommodations and what the essential functions of my job playing in this tournament are. So the next step of that, after a determination of what's essential, is that even if her press interviews were considered essential, there could potentially be a way to provide accommodations that would address her specific disability-related concerns, as well as address the tournament's requirements for these press interviews. So, maybe she gets questions ahead of time so she can feel better prepared, and that might alleviate her anxiety. Maybe she just does one-on-one interviews so it feels a little less crowded and chaotic, and that alleviates her anxiety. Maybe she answers questions later on a video or a live stream so she feels more comfortable at home. There's not going to be a prescribed set of accommodations that are going to work for everyone. It's supposed to be this very interactive process, and that's what it's called in the language of the law. And that takes into account the individual's disability and how it impacts her in this specific moment. So keeping that interactive process in mind would be really important for other athletes who are signing or negotiating a contract where they might have disability related concerns. This is the kind of thing that in advance of an incident like this, other athletes might be able to consider and think about now that this has become more of a kind of common knowledge conversation that people are having. How can they change what might be considered essential elements, but still have a contract in place that allows everyone to be happy? And, again, I have to say, I recognize that it's easy to say this and do this analysis on behalf of athletes under this very kind of detached legal framework. It's a lot harder in the real world because of stigma for an athlete or really anyone else out there in the world who's negotiating employment to feel comfortable enough to disclose details of a disability, especially when they feel like it could cost them substantial money or the ability to progress in their career. So that's what all of us as athletes and fans really need to continue to work on advocating for and providing support for.
I think that's a really good point as you were talking about changing this into an analogy of an employer-employee situation. I do think that we're going to start seeing employment or sports contracts changing. At least that's my hope, that we're going to start seeing the inclusion of these types of clauses or provisions within the contracts that, as far as I know, don't exist quite yet. So, on a whole, it seems like there is some forward movement in addressing the stigma about disclosing mental health conditions. Obviously, I think we both could agree there's a long way to go. And it's not just for celebrities or famous people, but also for our workplaces and schools and even within our own family systems. Alison, what can we do when we talk about educating, we talk about putting more information out there, educating individuals who are in need of information of what to do when thinking about or considering disclosing information about their mental health? And what do we do about educating organizations or people who need to receive that information and know what to do about it?
Yeah, so you mentioned, and I think this is very true, that there has been some really good forward momentum in the sports world because some athletes now are choosing to speak out about it even before this happened. There have been a couple of others in recent years, at least in my world of running and triathlon, who have spoken out about the pressures that they faced, the depression that has really cost them performance and potential career progression, and the kind of lack of support that they've had when they chose to disclose. And so having that awareness, beginning those conversations is really going to be the first step in getting this out to the public to be viewed as more of a teachable moment. But unfortunately, a lot of the time it's still kind of treated as an anomaly. We need more athletes and professionals and people who are in the public eye to continue to engage in these conversations in that kind of public eye, directly with the fans, directly with media. And we also need the brands that sponsor these athletes to support calls for mental health and well-being in sports. And we're seeing a little bit of that, which is, I think, very positive. Nike, who is one of Naomi Osaka's big sponsors, did release a statement saying, we support her and recognize her courage in sharing her own mental health experience. So to me, this kind of public support from big name brands that are choosing to firmly stand behind her really shows a buy-in to continue to have conversations about mental health. And that's the kind of thing that needs to be normalized in order for us as a whole to feel more comfortable having those educational moments about what does happen when someone discloses, or what does happen when someone chooses to start a conversation about mental health. In terms of how to translate that to our day-to-day lives, that kind of has to be an individual decision. Some people are really open about disclosing their struggles with mental health, just like some people are really open about physical health. And on the flip side, some people are incredibly private, and that's their choice. But if someone does choose to disclose to an employer, to school, to friends and family, we need to work on what happens next and how we can support that person and not contribute to stigma or bias or discrimination. Employers or educators or family members can choose to engage in positive conversations instead of just shutting it down. and talking about what might be needed if an accommodation conversation is started, rather than just kind of dismissing it or diminishing it or refusing to even engage in talking about potential accommodations. For someone who has a mental health diagnosis who's trying to kind of figure out how to navigate any of these systems, I would also encourage them to know about their rights, whether they're working or they're in school or in some other situation where their mental illness may be impacting their life, or they may feel like they're being discriminated against. Because I firmly believe that feeling more confident in self-advocacy, feeling more confident in understanding what your rights are, is a huge tool that will really, really help to not only start a conversation, but continue it in a positive direction and influence the people that you're trying to discuss this with, whether that's employers or educators. It will only benefit you to be more aware of what you're entitled to.
And we have some great resources on the DRNY website. We'll certainly put the links to those in the description of this podcast. Alison, again, this is a big topic, and I'm sure it's one that we're going to talk about again soon. Thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to talking with you again.
Thank you so much.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed captioned and ASL version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights closed captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.